Hi everyone. So welcome to the Kickoff event for the Summer of Language Model 21, short names BigScience, which is this 1 year research workshop on large multilingual datasets and large language model. So in this introduction, we'll go over the philosophy and the quick history of the event, and then the tools and how it looks in practice. So let's start with the philosophy. So what is this? Well, in many fields, we have like these very large tools that are built by diverse worldwide research collaboration. One example I take often is the Large Hadron Collider, which is this like, I think the biggest research tool ever built, which has involved like 10,000 researchers from 100 countries. It led to the discovery of 59 hadron, if you know what is a hadron, and the publication of more than 2,800 papers. So a lot of reviewing work as well. I don't know if we want that in the field, but anyway, the thing is that this very large collaboration, they create tools which are useful for really the entire research communities. These tools, these very large tools, they are used by all the researchers in particle physics. They are super useful. And one idea is maybe it's time to build similar large, diverse, and very open research collaboration in AI and NLP as well. And why would this be the right time? Because we see in particular in NLP that many recent developments come from training very large models on very large data sets. And typically the compute resources that people use to do that, they're found only in industry, only in big tech companies typically. And this causes a number of problems. There's some problems from the research point of view that these models usually are not designed as general research tool. They lack access to the training data set, for instance. Sometimes they are private. And many research questions are actually asked after the model was trained, just because there is a limit to the size of the team who create this model. And so they cannot just think about every question, right? Every research question. They're also very often Anglo-centric. And in general, we find it's quite difficult for the academic community to be involved in the building of this very large language model. There is some question around environment. Training this model in all private company kind of lead to very large duplication of the energy requirements. The carbon footprint is usually not as well documented as it could be. And there's a lot of question around ethics and social impacts, right? The text corpora that are used, now we know that they could be maybe better selected. It's an ongoing work, but this could be improved. And also there is a lot of ethics bias questions that are usually asked a posteriori after the model was trained. And maybe it would be interesting to involve also all the research community around all these questions and from the beginning. So, well, why this happen only in industry? Well, it could also happen in academia because there is many large-scale public compute infrastructure that exists. And I take one example, which is the Janzé supercomputer, which is a supercomputer we know well because we've been working with them for quite a long time. And if you look at this, it's quite powerful. It's actually really powerful. It's a supercomputer with close to 2,700 NVIDIA V100 GPUs. They're also interconnected with really fast interconnections. So this is the type of compute infrastructure which is perfectly suited to train very large language model and to actually do this type of research. So now this led to some early discussion between me, Stéphane Requena, and Pierre-François Lavallée, who are both, Jency is the builder of Janzé supercomputer and Idris is the operator. And we were discussing around this, and this actually led to the idea of maybe we could gather this type of large research committee around this supercomputer and try to prove that there is a way to do that as well, involving many more diverse community, I would say. So very quickly, the science team of Hugging Face was on board, and many members of the French academic and industrial AI and NLP research communities. And so we had a lot of discussion with about 80 to 90 people, I would say, in the beginning of 2021. And this led to finding a grant application for 5 million GPU hours on Janzé. And then following the grant submission, quickly it became really clear that we wanted this to be an international community. We wanted this to be an international collaboration. And so we started to reach out to everyone, and a lot of people were really interested. And so in a matter of weeks, we reached about 200 participants, whole research people from master to PI to people in the industry as well. And we started to shape the workshop, the project as a research workshop. This leads to a very open structure where everybody can basically join, which is also kind of self-organized, and which is in general in science. A research workshop and a research conference are some of the best examples of successful collaboration, successful brainstorming. So earlier this month, we heard that the grant was accepted. So we had the first half of the Compute Budget event to the project. And this led us to this first kickoff event where we're presenting the project publicly and where we're starting to set up the tools that people can use. The core research idea, the core research spark, I would say, is this recent trend in large model on large data set, which show intriguing and I would say quite surprising behavior from a research point of view. I think a lot of people in the research community were not expecting this type of statistical approach to be able to show these behaviors, but this raised many research questions. So I just highlighted a few of them, but there's a lot more, right? There is some fundamental question: what can we do with purely statistical methods? What is actually an NLP task when you don't even use a data set and you do zero shot? There is a lot of question around bias, representativeness, memorization, generalization, environmental impact, interpretability, relation to cognitive processes, and all this. And so the idea is basically to gather the research community around the creation of these artifacts, to kind of list in advance the research question that we would like to answer, and to prepare all the tools we will need to answer as many of these questions as possible. The idea is really to ask as many questions as possible a priori before we start designing a project, before we start training a model, rather than a posteriori. In the end, we plan to create and share these artifacts. So there is this multilingual corpus that we need to build in a way that could be hopefully more responsible, more diverse, more mindful of ethical, legal issues. And there is this very large model, as well as the code tool associated to them, in particular to make the model easy to use, in particular on small workstation. And then there is the meta approach, which is that this is kind of a new way to do collaboration. And we would like to document, to find, to share the processes, the documents that are useful, so that in the future people can take this project as an example or as something that can be reproduced in other places around maybe other public infrastructure or even around private compute infrastructures. Beyond the collaborative task, this is also a workshop. So it will be conducted online for 1 year. There will be several live events or live sessions, including this first one, which is the opening session. And Matthias and Angela will talk about the second one. We're already starting to plan. And the goal of the live events is basically to kind of synchronize, get together, present the work done, like in a research workshop with paper, posters, proceedings, and open the workshop to the general public as well. And basically just like a research workshop, right? To foster discussion, talk about all the research questions around these models, around the data set. And I think more than everything, this is a bit what we wanted to do, what you wanted to be, right? It's a blank page. We're trying to present a new way, an alternative way to do large-scale research collaboration. And it's really open to new ideas on how we can make this successful, how everybody at the end could be really happy to have participated in this new endeavor.
So I wanted to say a few words on how do we think this will work. We believe it might evolve over this year, but this is a snapshot I took yesterday. So today's Friday, 23rd, I believe. So this is a snapshot yesterday because the number was such a great number. So it's lots of people and it's not obvious how all those people should organize together. And so the workshop itself is structured in these working groups, and most, if not all, of the work happens in those working groups. The idea of the working groups is that they are rather independent, meaning that they have an idea what they should do, and that the communication between working group is minimal. And if happens, it happens on the steering committee or through the chairs. What you can see to the right are the current working groups. In green, those who already have chairs, at least one. In red, those which have been proposed, but at least as of today, do not have yet a chair, and hopefully by the time of the kickoff event, some of the red ones will actually move to the green parts. And of course, it's open to so you can propose an additional working group if you believe it makes sense. The thing that we have in mind is that each working group should have at least 2 chairs in order to help move this forward. So if you want to be involved, if you want to participate in this, yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, it was great. And there are a number of ways that you can be involved. So you can join to the steering committee, which is basically everybody who is probably watching this on the kickoff event. And by default, you're part of it. This means that you're part of a communication channel, which for the moment is Slack. And the idea here is that you give advice on organization, on science, on how to do things. With respect to time commitment, which is something I guess we are all here very worried about, this is rather light. The idea is that you should keep kind of updated with this newsletter, which will be sent around, and then give your opinion or your insights when you feel it is relevant. Then you can join a working group, and then you can join it as a participant, and then each one of the working groups will have a video which will tell you concrete next action steps, what you can do. So there, the time commitment really depends on the working group and how much you want to invest in this. It's a bit more though. And finally, you might want to chair or to co-chair an existing working group or to propose something new. And so here the time investment is a bit more significant. And if you're interested in these kinds of things, do reach out to the current chairs, the working groups, or to somebody on the organizing committee. And finally, there is another way that you can participate, which is more like an attendant. It's a bit more passive. So the idea is that in the future we'll have those live events. You can just dial in and see what's going on. And then we envision that potentially we might organize some live events like a hackathon where we can open it up a bit broader beyond people in the specific research community who can then contribute in a much lighter way. So this is kind of during the whole year, how it should work. On top of this, we plan to do some synchronous events. The organization of those kind of fall into the purview of this organizing working group. And then right now, we are currently aiming for at least 3 of such events. The first one is happening right now. The second one should be around July, and Angela will say a few more words in a second. And then finally, we plan to do something more towards the end of the workshop. And maybe we might make some intermediate checkpoints as well. The idea of those synchronous events is these are the moments to share the progress with potentially proceedings you will see, and also discuss any dependencies which there might be between the different working groups.
So let's talk about what's coming up next. First, we're going to have an event in July, which we just mentioned, and the goal of the event will be to share and present preliminary results for the working groups that have kind of already gotten going. And also, importantly, to discuss and brainstorm next directions, get feedback on these results. And one of the biggest byproducts of such an event, and one of our aims of organizing this entire thing, is for researchers all over the world to collaborate and get to know each other, which we think happen best in these types of live events, which we'll try and organize. Also, a lot of people have expressed interest in having publications as part of this workshop. And if you submit to a standard workshop such as ACL, usually you submit papers as well. So we're working on finalizing kind of the proceedings of this workshop, and you'll be able to publish your papers as part of the workshop and also have these papers peer reviewed. Now, biggest questions, some logistics. So first, how do you join a working group? So if you're interested in any of the roles that we just went over, add yourself to this document. It's editable by everyone. So please add yourself and express interest. We also have some more logistical questions that we want to answer. So if you want to broadly learn more about the effort, maybe this is the first time you're hearing about it, or just want to learn more before you commit to anything, feel free to check it out on our website. If you want to discuss with any other researchers in the project, we have a forum on Discourse. I have the link here. And finally, all of the things that we've been discussing, it's viewable by everyone on the internet. It's linked in this Google Drive, so you can read more about a lot of the things we went over in more detail, see who's involved already. And also, if you're missing any of the links, all of them are linked off the website as well, so don't worry about losing them. Finally, we're going to transition now into a bunch of talks of the different working groups. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the different parts of the project so far, or even if you see something that you want to propose yourself, go for it. Please enjoy the talks, and we'll also see you in GatherTown for the live discussion part. And finally, don't forget to add questions in the Dory app and also upvote questions so that we can answer those asynchronously. Thanks so much, everyone, and enjoy the event.
Hello, my name is Yassine Jarnit, and together with my colleague Angie Macmillan-Major, we will be presenting the data section of the Summer of Language Model 2021 workshop, or BigScience for short. In the course of the BigScience project, we are collaboratively training a large multilingual model in order to explore a number of research questions. The final model and the answers we can give to these questions will depend not only on the model architecture and training algorithm, but also on the language data the model learns from. Thus, the constitution of this training dataset and the exploration of the social and technical questions raised in its creation will be the focus of the 3 working groups we introduce in this presentation. So, how do we choose what to focus on in these working groups? Well, let's go over a few relevant aspects of language data that will inform how we organize the work. First, we build on the understanding that language is a social object. We can get a sense of what we mean by this with some examples. Here, we have a question submitted to the Reddit forum by a user asking, how much power does the president actually have? The answer depends on which president we're talking about. In this case, we know that most Redditors are based in the US, but how can the model learn that the question is underspecified if that's all there is in the data? This is just a simpler illustration of a broader phenomenon, but it does suggest that we should at least make an effort to obtain language data created around the world. We can make a similar point about other social dimensions beyond geographical ones, as we have seen in recently publicized models that overexposure to outgroup speech for categories such as religion, for example, can lead to strong negative biases in the model behaviors. A more intentional, inclusionary approach to the data creation process along a variety of social axes may not be sufficient to entirely mitigate such biases, but it is a likely first step in this direction and one we will explore. The second aspect we consider for this project is that language data has subjects whose rights must be taken into account. So we're talking about a few groups here. First, the data creators are the writers or the speakers of the language that we get in the dataset. We note, for example, that data creators may have different expectations about how public their texts or the speech that they produce will be. More broadly, data subjects are any groups or individuals that are mentioned in the language data or who the language data gives information about, which implicitly includes the data creators. Both the data creators and the data subjects have rights granted to them by existing regulations, such as the European GDPR. But we also note that since the technologies and language technologies that are applied are changing so rapidly, we may want to consider what the interest of those data subjects is beyond existing regulations. Now we've talked about language as a social object and about respecting the rights of data subjects. The third point that is at the basis of this project is that we believe documentation is paramount for addressing the first 2 aspects. And it's going to be important in various ways. First, we're talking about building a more representative and more diverse dataset. We can only measure this representativeness if we have an accurate picture of what is in the dataset that we create. A good documentation is also instrumental to respecting some of the data subjects' rights. For example, we can only implement a subject's right to be forgotten if we know where they might be represented in the data. And finally, we have some scientific goals of understanding the model behavior, and we need to be able to do that in the light of what is in the training dataset, which is only possible if we can explore this dataset. So let's recap. We are aiming to present a clear positioning with respect to data regulations in our data creation effort, and motivate our choices with respect to their impact on data subjects. We need to gather a large quantity of language data to train a large language model in a way that supports the model's ambitions of generality and multilingualism. And finally, while doing this, we need to provide clear, useful documentation of the dataset component and the dataset design. And we need to be able to develop appropriate infrastructure to both train easily using the dataset and to be able to explore the dataset to answer questions. These goals will be the responsibilities of 3 working groups. The first working group will be concerned with questions of data governance and archival strategies. The second working group will be working on data sourcing and representativeness. And the third working group will work on data tooling and do everything that we need to go from the data sources to a usable, well-indexed training dataset. We will go into more detail as to what is expected in each of these working groups in the rest of this presentation. After that, you can fill out the Google form on the website to join any of the groups and find a document in the Google Drive that gives more detail into what's expected in each of those. So let's start with the working group on data governance and archival strategies. The choices that we make in the creation of the data sets involve a range of stakeholders. There's us, obviously, as participants in this BigScience project that have our own needs regarding the data sets. But anyone who ends up interacting with the artifacts that we produce is also a stakeholder, as is any person who's affected by choices made based on the findings of the workshop. As a result, we need to consider what our legal and ethical responsibilities are when constituting the datasets, who we are answerable to directly and indirectly in those responsibilities, and what mechanisms we are putting in place to evaluate whether we are meeting these responsibilities. We will have 3 collaborative tasks in this working group to explore those questions. The first collaborative task will be on governance methods for aggregated language data, and will be tasked with evaluating existing modes of data governance that have various relationships to the stakeholders, assessing the relevance of these governance models to the specific project with the specific social implications of using speech and text data, and based on that, adapting recommendations to the dataset and the dataset creation process. We will have a second collaborative task focused specifically on legal frameworks for data use around the world, with a range of responsibilities, from laying the groundwork of identifying all relevant regulations to defining a positioning for the projects that can work both for the modeling needs and to help us collaborate with partner institutions. And finally, provide internal guidelines for the other working groups to be coherent with our positioning. And finally, we'll have a third collaborative task in this working group on infrastructure needs and figuring out an indexing and metadata strategy. Good indexing and good discoverability, as we mentioned previously, is important to the scientific goals of the project, but also to implement legal requirements and the governance requirements formulated by the first collaborative task. You should join this working group if you are interested in participating in any of these efforts, especially if you are excited in work that happens across disciplines and in dialogue between technology, society, and regulation. To do so, please fill out the form by selecting the Dataset Governance and Archival Strategies working group. And you can find more details, as mentioned, on the support document. I will now pass the presentation to my colleague Angie, who will talk to you about the next 2 working groups.
The second working group is on data sourcing and representativeness. The goal of this working group is to find a diverse set of data sources for a range of languages and to provide tools to measure that diversity. We are starting with 8 broadly defined language groups. The scope of the language choices should be further developed as part of the working group, along with formalizing what constitutes representativeness across languages and regions. This will result in specific recommendations to guide the selection of the language sources. Within the working group, we are proposing a collaborative task for developing frameworks and tools for representativeness across regions. The goals of this task include ethnographies of the cultural categories in the various regions of the world, understanding the visibility of underrepresented groups in existing language resources, and discussions on existing and prospective consequences of underrepresentation. Language data can be gathered from public forums, donated by users, created by experts, translators, or volunteers, transcribed from books or audio speech, and leased from libraries. Exploring all of these media sources and more allows us to create a more representative data set. We expect this task to provide an overview of existing successful efforts for data collection, especially outside of the US, and best practices to facilitate the work with the language groups. We selected an initial set of 8 language groups to work on so that we could maximize geographical representativeness. But there are still a number of questions as to how we conceptualize the notion of languages, especially in a way that is less focused on the European ones, as this definition has bearing not only on the way resources are allocated during the data set creation, but also on tokenization, modeling, and even evaluation choices. This collaborative task asks the following questions. How do we operationalize language in our tools, modeling, and evaluation? And what other language varieties should we add? As previously mentioned, we are looking for language sources that are geographically diverse for each of the language varieties. We also expect other dimensions of diversity to be dependent on the geographical regions. Because of this, language focus groups should identify relevant regions to organize their efforts around. For example, Portuguese language data should include sources and define social categories that are specifically relevant to European, Brazilian, African, and Asian speakers. For each of the regions, the task groups will gather and document a collection of language data sources relevant to the region and build collaborations with organizations engaged in similar work. Ways to go about this might include finding crawling seeds that reflect community internet usage, transcribing radio programs, or establishing a working relationship with an archival institute to borrow their text data. Please join this working group to apply research in the relevant fields, to collaborate with language communities and organizations in data collection processes, and to build well-documented, curated language resources. Again, please fill out the form and select dataset, data sourcing, and representativeness to join. The final working group will be on data tooling and processing the data sources into a finalized training set. Given all of the intersections of language variety, geographical region, domain, and data type, we will need a lot of tools to process the data into one format that serves as the input to the language model. We will have a working group for each of processing the visual data and speech data into text, processing and documenting the text from the web, detecting private information, and constructing an efficient database infrastructure. Our goal is to gather language data in a variety of formats, especially for languages where web content is less prevalent. The data processing step will rely on tools to process text such as books and PDF and other formats, transcribe spoken language, identify text, and run OCR on images of documents in all considered language varieties. Given its widespread availability and convenient digital format, we expect that a significant part of the text data will come from web content. We need tools both to gather this content through customizable shallow crawling and to automatically document it as much as possible. Tools for automatic documentation include automatic register identification, dialect identification, terms of service extraction, and more in all considered language varieties. We want to gather and, more importantly, maintain a corpus that is respectful of the data subject's privacy and rights. So we need to be able to identify that information and address it. The development of the private information detection and de-identification tools that work across the variety of domains in all considered languages will be the focus of this working group. Finally, all gathered language data needs to be represented in a common document format that allows for efficient processing at training time while retaining relevant characteristics of the varied source formats. In addition, the data needs to be indexed in a way that is easy to navigate and query and helps identify duplicated content. The purpose of this working group is to work on infrastructure to meet those requirements. Please join this working group to build robust data processing tools for many language varieties, many domains, and many data types, and also to design and implement a big but organized data set. Fill out the form and select dataset and tooling and infrastructure if you'd like to join. And thank you for being interested in this project. We look forward to working with you, and please see the website for any documentation or questions.
Hi, I'm Victor, and I'm chairing the working group on the modeling approach. It is very exciting to see that a lot of you have already expressed interest in participating to this working group. In this presentation, I will give you a short overview of the goals and objectives of this working group. So what is our goal? Very large language models trained on a very large data set display emergent prompting and priming behaviors. By conditioning on the task description and priming example pairs, the model generates an output for a given input and gets non-trivial performance on a diversity of benchmarks. However, these behaviors feel somewhat accidental. When training a large enough language model on enough text, the model learns non-trivial skills for which supervised signal was thought to be necessary. However, prompting and priming are a fickle art right now because of the model's brittleness to the format of the prompt and examples. Our moonshot goal is to answer in natural language any prompting query expressed in natural language in a zero-shot manner. We want to make these prompting abilities more explicit and robust, rather than solely relying on poorly understood emergent behaviors, by providing as much as possible signal that resembles prompting. So the focus of this working group is on determining a training objective and data format that encourage the model to learn robust prompting behaviors. There are three main desired outcomes to this working group. First, we want a very large multilingual language model trained with the best identified training objective and data format for our moonshot goal. We expect that the size of this model will be in the order of magnitude of GPT-3, and we plan on training and releasing intermediate sizes. Second, we want a public code base gathering the code and the tools developed in this project. Code should be documented so that it can be a starting point for future endeavors. Last, we want one or multiple focus papers describing the model, the modeling approach with experiments and analysis of the design choices. So there are multiple facets and aspects to the goal that we introduced. The first one is on improving prompting behaviors. So this aspect is interested in the emergence of zero-shot prompting behaviors in very large language models and aims at making these abilities more robust. We invite participation from collaborators who have experience or are interested in prompt engineering, weak supervision and weak labeling, data programming, etc. So there are three main outcomes. We expect a comparative study of multiple alternatives to include prompting behaviors. There will also be some manual labor to scale the proof of concept previously introduced to create or extract prompting instances. And last, we also want some debugging and visualization tools for prompting instances. The second aspect is on multilinguality. So this aspect is interested in ensuring the model still has non-trivial zero-shot abilities beyond English. We invite participation from collaborators with expertise with multilingual models and tools, and also first language speakers of the groups of languages identified by the data working group. The outcomes will be a comparative study of the specificities of multilingual models, and also how it translates into our context of prompting instances. We also want a data set of prompting instances in all the groups of languages identified, and this will likely require some manual labor. A third aspect is on context. So inputs alone often don't contain enough information, and providing additional context is required to faithfully react to the prompt, without hallucinating or memorizing random things. Retrieving context has shown to increase the factuality of generative models, while providing a mechanism to update the knowledge of the language model through time. We invite collaborators with experience with systems integrating retrieval steps. There are two main outcomes. First, comparisons of multiple alternatives to retrieve context and external knowledge, and implementing them in an efficient indexing mechanism so that we can use it during the training. In the same vein, we are also interested in the situation in which a text is written. Metadata are high-level information and attributes extracted from the data sources that condition the content of the document. Metadata gives information about the situation in which a document was written, and it is a source of signal that we want to squeeze out to condition text on available metadata as an additional source of context. We invite collaborators who have experience in the controllability of generative models. The outcomes on the aspect would be an overview of the available metadata information and formulating recommendations on which of these metadata could be useful to train a language model. We also want some tools to navigate the metadata for each document and perform high-level operations. Before training the very large language model, we want to figure out the best way to scale. So this aspect on scaling loads and training is we require tight coordination with the engineering and scaling working group to first implement the model and the different training configurations, and second, optimize the training for the supercomputer infrastructure. So we invite participation from collaborators who have experience or are interested in scaling properties of language models. The outcomes would be trained models of different sizes, and also recommendations on the best model configuration for a fixed number of parameters, compute budget, dataset size, and languages. We are also going to share a training code base and documentation to reproduce training. The societal impacts aspect is a part of every aspect that I previously introduced, but we wanted to clearly identify it as a core component of this working group, rather than a cherry on the cake. We want to weigh in potential societal consequences as a part of the design process, right from the beginning. This will require coordination with the Societal Impact Working Group for general guidelines and perspectives with respect to the overall BigScience endeavor. We are very excited that you're interested in joining this collaborative effort. How can you get involved in this modeling approach working group? So first, please make sure that you have answered the Google form and check the box on the modeling approach working group. So it will ensure that you have access to our Google Drive where we share the main documents. Second, I will highly encourage you to join the discussion forum, the BigScience Workshop Discussion Forum, where most of the discussion will be actually happening. And last, please also read the entry point document for the modeling working group, where we also clarified how we're going to function as a working group. Thank you and see you soon.
Hi everyone, we are the tokenization working group for the Summer of Language Models, and so this working group will be chaired by Benoit Sago from INRIA, France, and myself, Samson Tan from Salesforce and the National University of Singapore. So the motivation for this working group is that before any neural network or language model can be trained, all text input has to be converted into integer sequences, right? And basically a tokenizer is a tool that segments raw text into individual units that are from a fixed size vocabulary. And each of these units will then be converted into embedding vectors that will be operated on by the language model. So many existing subword tokenizers use a two-step process where the raw text is first split into so-called traditional tokens or pre-processed. then the tool then decides when and how to split these tokens into smaller subword units, which are the final tokens. And so here we have an example below on the slide. Yeah, and
so in this working group, we will have to address a number of research questions and carry out a number of experiments. The idea is to carry out a number of experiments to evaluate in one way or another a number of tokenization techniques, so as to be able to choose the one that we'll be using in the final model. We want to be able to explain why we did choose a particular tokenization method rather than another one. The problem is, it is not very easy to evaluate the quality of a tokenization technique. And that is because we will not be able to train full-scale models that rely on different tokenization methods. So we will have either to come up with metrics that can evaluate tokenization approaches without training a language model, but that is not necessarily a very easy task, or we will have to come up with metrics that are able to evaluate the quality of tokenization methods on smaller scale models. But then there is the question of whether the conclusions that will be drawn from these experiments will actually generalize to the large scale model that we intend to train in the end. So these are open questions that we will have to discuss in the working group. Another research question is to understand how we can determine scaling laws for vocabulary size, because if we carry out experiments on smaller language models, we probably do not want to use the same vocabulary sizes than what we will be using for the larger model. So we will have to better understand how we can draw interesting conclusions from smaller scale experiments by using smaller vocabularies and transfer these conclusions to the larger model setting. And another research question is, how can we improve existing tokenization methods to adapt them to the fact that we'll be dealing with multilingual, multi-script data? We have obviously to compare our experiment results to baselines. The baseline, as far as the training corpus is concerned, will be the large multilingual common crawl based freely downloadable corpus OSCAR, which is, for instance, available in the datasets library by Hugging Face. But of course, the dataset working group will provide the final dataset at the end. But OSCAR will serve as a baseline, as a basis for our preliminary experiments. And then, as far as tokenization tools are concerned, there are quite a number of baselines, which I'm sure you all know. We'll probably use sentence piece as a baseline, but there are also we could also use word piece, byte BP, and other ways or other tools for tokenization. Finally, I'd like to stress the major challenges that we'll be facing in this working group. I think the main challenge, the most difficult challenge, is the fact that we are dealing with multilingual and multi-script data to be trained on and to be tokenized. An important question is to understand how we can make sure that different scripts are actually tokenized fairly. So there are at least two difficult questions in that regard. The first one is, how do we account for the fact that sharing the same script, and as a result, at least some of the tokens, subwords, etc., can affect the language's effective vocabularies. So basically, we have more than one language that uses the Latin script, and this might have a favorable effect for these languages if we use baseline tokenization techniques. And the other big challenge is how can we account for differences in character inventory sizes and average number of characters per word? Because obviously the distribution of characters in, say, English, for instance, and Chinese is not at all the same. And maybe using the same method and same thresholds on English and Chinese data will result in Chinese being over tokenized with respect to English, for instance. This is the other question that we'll need to investigate in terms of multilinguality and multi-script setting. Two other major challenges, obviously, as mentioned before, generalizing from small-scale experiments to a large scale setting, which is our final setting, is not trivial. And at the same time, we will need our tokenization tool to be very fast because it will be used on a very large corpus. And just to conclude, well, please get involved in our working group if you're interested. Respond to the Google form, join the tokenization working group, and obviously, if you're interested in the BigScience workshop, please join the discussion forum as well. And that's it for us. Thanks very much.
Okay.
All right. Hi, I'm Ellie Pavlik.
I'm Marine Carpua. I'm Verena Rieser.
And I'm Sebastian Gern.
And we are representing the evaluation working group for the Summer of Language Models BigScience project. So the goal of this working group is basically to determine a set of standards for what it means for a language model to be, quote, good, acknowledging that there are lots of different ways of measuring that and that we will need some kind of multifaceted evaluation suites in order to compare different models to one another and compare them to some kinds of extrinsic measures of goodness, whether that's human performance or theoretical performance or other kind of things determined by kind of ground truth or policies. So the kind of two main deliverables or goals of the working group is to come up with sets of standardized measures for evaluating models and to design this kind of multifaceted suite of evaluations for doing that. And we want to acknowledge and be cognizant of all of the different ways that language models are used, both the different scientific communities, whether that's computer science with machine learning and NLP, or linguistics and cognitive science, and the various applications where language models are used, and also all of the different ways in which language models are used in practice that affect people, when they're used in products such as search, question answering, translation, etc. And so we're planning to structure the working group into 5 kind of subgroups that get at different aspects of this evaluation. So we've listed 5 subgroups here. Obviously, these are kind of growing and evolving. And if you're interested in evaluation in any of these groups or in other groups that you think should be included, you should sign up to join the working group and come to future meetings and help kind of shape how this will be structured. Right now, we're going to talk about 5 different categories where we think there's kind of ongoing work on which we can build, but then obviously still a lot of work to do. So the first is extrinsic types of evaluations, which really asks how well models perform on the types of tasks that we typically think of in NLP, like language understanding tasks like question answering, or language generation tasks like summarization. We also want to look at intrinsic evaluations, so evaluations that are based on how well the representations of the model itself encodes certain types of linguistic features. So we can think of all the evaluations based on kind of word similarity metrics, syntactic evaluations, or any of those kinds of embedding based visualizations of what are the representations of code. Generalization and robustness, where we're interested in how the model will learn from limited data and how it will generalize out of domain. Fairness and kind of measuring and mitigating harmful behaviors. So we want to work on thinking about the social impact of these models. How do we measure those things, and how do we compare models in terms of fairness related standards? And then a big push in BigScience in general is making sure the models are multilingual. So we have to think about how to cast all of these evaluations in multilingual terms, whether that's just comparing the same types of evaluations across many different languages, or comparing how models that are trained in one language generalized to new languages.
Diving a bit deeper on the extrinsic evaluations, we mainly want to address two research questions. The first one is that we want to identify how well a model performs on important NLU and NLG tasks in a zero-shot fashion, but also whether the model can learn continuously during training. So, for example, can it be continuously adapted to new tasks without catastrophic forgetting? Obviously, this will be done in close collaboration with the modeling working group, and we'll also try to integrate with existing benchmark tasks for the various aspects of evaluation. For example, for NLU, we're going to integrate with the superglue benchmark and the dynabench one. For NLG, there's GEM. For a combination of these two, there's the DECA NLP benchmark. And specifically targeting few short capabilities, we'll integrate with the big bench. Coming to the intrinsic evaluations, we're interested in research question regarding how well a model representations encode important features of a language, for example, the morphology, the syntax, or the semantics. And also how it compares to our standing of human representations according to the research that is conducted in linguistics and in cognitive science. There is a lot of overlap here regarding these research questions with the interpretability and interaction working group, where we'll closely collaborate on these kinds of works. And there are some representative papers and ongoing efforts that we're going to try and replicate in our framework as well, such as probing tasks and psycholinguistic test suites.
Right, now moving on to evaluating generalization and robustness. So if you want about the emoji, here we train on apples and then we compare to oranges. The first two research questions are about generalization. So first, one question is, how well does the model learn from limited examples? So this is obviously very important when we do zero shot. Second question is, what inductive biases does it have when tested out of domain? So those are the oranges. And then the last question is related to robustness. How vulnerable is the model to adversarial attacks? And all of these questions are obviously related to the modeling working group, but also there are overlaps with questions about energy and carbon footprint. There are a couple of ongoing efforts. Only a few of them are listed here. For generalization, there are a lot of papers, including some papers by this working group. There's the scan benchmark, and there's various works on robustness, only a few listed here. Then evaluating fairness and harmful behaviors of these large models. So obviously, because they're trained of very large data set, we have to assume that there will be some negative biases encoded in these models. So that's one of the research questions. What are those biases and how can we measure them? And then the second research question is related to the risks. So what are the real world impacts associated when we employ these language models? Which is obviously also related to downstream tasks. So here we are working with data, diversity and inclusion, and again, energy and carbon footprint. There are lots of ongoing papers and efforts in these areas. There's a very nice overview survey, and there are a couple of data sets out there which are already evaluating harmful biases in large language models, including stereoset, bold, and toxic degeneration. With respect to risks and safety, so that's the basically real world impact, that's much harder to measure. So here we are assuming that there will be short-term risks, such as giving medical advice or other bad counsel in safety critical situations, which also could include financial advice and mental health crises and so on. And then there are more long-term risks, which again are related to biases, such as reinforcing negative stereotypes. And these are specific to end users and specific target groups. So not every harmful behavior is equally harmful for different target groups. If you, for example, think about vulnerable users such as children.
So multilinguality is a central goal of the BigScience project, and so naturally it'll be a big part of the evaluation. The first research question that is relevant here is simply to know how well the model performs across languages. And so that means that for all the evaluation categories we're interested in, it can't just be an evaluation on English, but it has to include tasks that represent all the languages in the project, whether that's for intrinsic evaluation, extrinsic, generalization, and fairness. Another question is how well does a model generalize to new languages, and to what extent does performance in one language predict performance in another? Doing all this will, of course, require collaborations with other working group. The data one is a close one, of course, given that it'll determine which languages are included, which data is the model trained on, and that will coordinate to make sure there's no overlap between the training and test data. There are also close connections with the diversity and inclusion working group so that the people who design the task for evaluation represent a broad diversity of language spoken and participants. There are already papers and ongoing efforts that we can build on here. Two examples are listed here. There's existing data sets for high-level tasks like question answerings that have been built to include typologically diverse languages. And at a lower level, more intrinsic level, there's also data sets that have been constructed to evaluate lexical semantic similarity in multilingual and cross-lingual ways. But these are just starting point, and so please get involved if you have your own tasks, your own data that you want to use in this project. So how do you get involved? You can simply answer the Google form that's listed here and mark that you want to join the evaluation working group. You can also join the BigScience Workshop discussion forum at the link provided and take a look at the website for broader information.
Hi, hello, I'm Hendrik Strobelt, and I'm currently chair for the working group on interpretability and interaction visualization for the Summer of Language Models 2021. You know our big example, it's the Large Hadron Collider. And when we think about this massive construct, this big experiment, what do scientists need to actually make it useful? They need tooling to help control the experiment, but they also need tooling to look into the results and gain insights. Yeah, here you see some examples for the Large Hadron Collider. And in the same sense, we think the interpretability and interactive visualization group actually can help here. So our high-level goals are developing interactive tools and developing methods to help, for example, identify biases in datasets and later in trained models. We want to create tools to help understand and analyze latent spaces of trained models. Think about tautology as a keyword here. We want to be able to help visually debugging models. Think about expert here as a tool that's already out there. We also want to create interactive prototypes for human AI generation to help evaluate a model under human constraints. Another interesting aspect is that these language models can help generating text, but we also want to be able to create methods to detect text that was model generated. Think of Grover or Glitter as examples here that are already in the public. And of course, we are very open to whatever you like to do in an interactive manner, and where you think there might be a mutual benefit between the data group, the model group, the evaluation group, and the interaction group. So we think of the group as being a horizontal working group. So if you think about the whole workshop as having a workshop organization and then all the different working groups contributing to the training process and to the evaluation and to the data modeling, etc., etc., we think of us being horizontal, and wherever we can help, we'll try to interact with the experts from the other working group to create tooling that is helpful. In my own experience, I think this is really a unique chance for collaboration between interpretability and visualization experts with data model and evaluation experts. So there's never been a better time to join us now. Thank you and see you in the group meetings.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yasin Jamnit. I am organizing the data effort of this workshop, and we're going to talk to you now about some of the newer working groups. So you have already heard or will soon see in other videos presentations of the working groups that are already organized or underway. But now we're going to talk to you about some of the other working groups that are no less important, but are still taking off, or working groups that we would like to see get started soon.
Hello, I'm Karen Faure. It occurred to us that the social impact issues are occurring and probably will occur in most of the groups, and that a transversal working group could be useful to address this. So this is a group that stretches across groups, and that we hope could be interesting for at least 1 or 2 persons in each group, so that we can coordinate the work on social impact across all the groups. We aim at centralizing resources and expertise to share experiments and experience with you, to engage with existing organizations and to develop best practices among us, and also to evaluate the social impact of the project as a whole at the intersection of what all the working groups have come up with. Also, to be sure that the ethnography of the participants of BigScience allows us to understand the issues and to compare what we had in mind at the start of the workshop and what will be the end product of it. So it will be really great if at least 1 person of each working group would register to this transversal social impact group. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Teven Lescaro, and I'm a researcher here at Hugging Face. I'm very excited that we've already been allocated 2.5 million GPU hours, and we'll probably be allocated a total of 5 million GPU hours by Janzé, which is the cluster that is hosting this project. Now, this is a very, very sizable amount of compute, and so accordingly, we have a dual working group of engineering and scaling, which will be focusing on both the technical aspects of training a large language model on that many GPUs, and on the research questions on how to make the best use of that compute budget. This working group will have a lot of interplay with the modeling team, with their architecture and objective decisions, and also with external teams, both from NVIDIA, which is the provider of the hardware on Janzé, and with other organizations that have already trained such large language models. This is a very nascent working group, and so there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of interesting questions, and we're very excited for you to join it and to bring your own topics to the table. Even though not everyone will be able to have access to Janzé, because there's quite strong national restrictions and background checks to be able to use it, that doesn't mean that you won't be able to participate to the working group if you don't have access. So have no fear on that subject. And now for the collaboration working group.
Thank you. My name is Tjuke Hupkes. I'm a research scientist at Facebook AI Research. I'm the current chair of the working group about collaboration with research and education communities, which really considers involvement of the research community more at large, outside of the researchers that are actively involved in the project. So for instance, we've been talking with large existing excellence networks such as ALICE and CLAIRE and ACL special interest groups, We are thinking on how to involve undergraduate and graduate programs at university, maybe collaborate with workshops that are already organized, or maybe even outside the research community to the more general public. We are, well, a new working group currently consisting of only 2 people, and we're still very much in a brainstorm phase, which is why I would really like to get a lot of input from many of you. What we're currently thinking about is, for instance, joint events such as workshops or hackathons or like challenges that groups can participate in, or a shared task, something like that. Or perhaps we can set up some thesis projects for bachelor and master students that they can work on a small sub-project within the larger project, or make some educational or interactive materials about the workshop. Some entities that we've already been in contact with are Alice and Claire and the ACL Special Interest Group. So for instance, for Alice, we've been in contact with their NLP program, and we're discussing with them how to set up a collaboration. We might join some of their workshop, their next workshop to have a breakout session there to brainstorm. So many ideas, nothing very worked out yet. I'm very excited about this, and I think that it's a really important thing to keep in mind. So I really hope that also some of you share this excitement with me and join this working group, because the more ideas, the better. And these things are typically worked out best in a somewhat distributed way. So I hope to hear from some of you.
Hi, I'm Changwen Xu. I'm a sorry. Yeah, I'm a researcher at Hugging Face, and I'm trying to form a new group called Carbon Footprint Workshop. Work group, and the working group discusses the following topics. First, we estimate the carbon footprint of the collaborative tasks, including model training, inference, evaluation, dataset creation, and sharing. And we also are trying to figure out how to minimize the carbon dioxide emission and more broadly, the environmental impact. And we are in charge of writing environmental impact sections for each paper and report throughout the workshop. So how do we achieve that? We send Google Forms and make tools to collect data, including GPU models, GPU hours, electricity source, so we can estimate the carbon footprint. And we also work closely with the modeling team, engineering team, and evaluation team to reduce their carbon footprints. So if you are a researcher with knowledge of green AI or NLP, or if you are an ecologist or environmentalist, you should definitely join our work group.
The BigScience research project is basically a blank page and a new endeavor open for new ideas. So please feel free to propose new ideas for working groups, or even defining redefining the scope of existing working groups. So I'm Victor, I'm co-chairing the working group on modeling. So if you want to redefine the scope of this working group, please feel free to contact the organizer or myself. So how do you do that? So first, we just want to say that it's awesome to see that you're excited to either propose a new working group, join a working group, or even chair or co-chair a working group. How do you propose a new working group? So we would suggest that you go on the BigScience working group Google Docs and copy paste the template and fill out at least the scoped part of this template, so that we can know why this working group is important, why these aspects are important, and what kind of like the work and desired outcome of this working group. If you want to participate or even co-chair a working group, also feel free to edit, to suggest in this Google Doc. Please use the suggestion mode so that we can receive a notification. Thanks for sticking with us until now. I hope you enjoyed the talks, and we will definitely see you in Gather Town for live QA and social interactions. All right. So that's the end of the pre-recorded talks. That's the end of the pre-recorded talk. So now let's switch to the Gather Town. You have the links in the Google Doc, where you have like the details with all the links and the time slot. I see that a lot of you are already in the Gather Town, so see you there. Bye.